This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 604 of the Late Round Podcast, so many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper show is probably a below-average one. We got nothing from Devontae Parker, Justin Fields and Gabriel Davis didn't even play, Cole Kmet and CJ Uzomah were mediocre streamers, and the defensive streamers didn't do a whole lot either. And then there was Samaje Perine who didn't do anything with Joe Mixon being healthy. Amon-Ra St. Brown was good again though. Justin Jackson balled out, Allen Lazard paid off, and even Antoine Wesley was able to score 11 PPR points. It could have been worse, but I'd like to go out on top this week. Before getting into the sleepers this week, hey sports fans, FanDuel is now offering an exciting twist to the beloved Same Game Parlay. Now introducing the Same Game Parlay Plus, which allows you to combine the same game parlays across multiple games. All you have to do is head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook and navigate to the Same Game Parlay tab of the first game that you're interested in. Select multiple bets from the first game and then plus it up. Now you can add more bets from other Same Game Parlay labeled games. Head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook today and opt into the Same Game Parlay Plus. Must be 21 years or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Max bonus $1,000 in site credit. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Same Game Parlay Plus available for multiple sports in all states on mobile/web. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. In Connecticut, call 888-789-777 or visit ccpg.org/chat. In Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. For confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-270-7117. In Tennessee, call the Red Line at 1-800-889-9789. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Or in Arizona, call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342. As usual, the first tier of players that I talk about on this show are guys who are rostered in 50 to 70% of Yahoo leagues. Van Jefferson's one that I want to talk about this week. His target shares haven't been great over his last 3 games. He's seen target shares of 10%, 7%, and 16% over this time. But according to Pro Football Focus, Jefferson is running a similar number of routes as Cooper Kupp and Odell Beckham. Last week, the 3 had almost identical routes run numbers. And over the last 3, he's run just 2 fewer routes than Kupp. The Rams get the Ravens this week, and the Ravens are struggling in the secondary. They just gave up big performances to Bengals wide receivers, and the week before that, Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Davante Adams both finished as top 15 wide receivers against them. Even the Browns in week 14 had Jarvis Landry and Donovan Peoples-Jones score 15 and 14 PPR points. Jefferson is the right type of upside play this week. The Rams shouldn't have trouble moving the ball through the air, and he's been on the field a lot despite his lower target shares. Now, I just mentioned Jarvis Landry, and I like him this week as well. He got 5 of 10 targets for 65 yards against the Steelers the last time we saw Cleveland and Pittsburgh play, and he's averaged a 25.5% target share per game since returning from injury in Week 7. Now, he hasn't provided a super high ceiling, and we should consider him more of a floor play. But Landry's played 60% of his snaps this year from the slot, and Pittsburgh ranks 5th in target share allowed to the slot this year. So Landry makes sense as a safe option. Darrell Williams is still available in 30% of Yahoo leagues. That number should change given the fact that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is banged up. If CEH doesn't go this weekend, Williams should see a good amount of work in a decent matchup. Without CEH earlier this year, like I mentioned on the 15 Transaction Show, Williams averaged almost 18 PPR points per game with a running back rush share per game of almost 77%. That's why he needs to be rostered. And then one more player in this tier that I want to shout out is Elijah Moore. Remember him? He's been on IR with a quad injury, but the Jets have said that they expect him back. And a report on Wednesday said that he's 50-50 to play this week. And he gets Tampa Bay. It's a team that's faced the highest pass rate in the league this season, and the Bucs are 6th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. There's definitely some risk with Elijah Moore, don't get me wrong. But if you need high upside, Moore is in play. Because keep in mind, he was averaging over 20 PPR points per game over his 5 games before his injury. Taysom Hill works as a streamer this week. He's still within the 25 to 50% rostered range, despite the fact that he's finished as a QB1 in 5 of his 7 career starts at quarterback. The Saints get a beatable matchup against Carolina, where they're 6.5-point home favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook. He's not my favorite streamer. He's not even really a traditional streamer, given his percent rostered number. But he's still a good play this week. Marquez Valdes-Scantling should be back this week from the COVID list. Or at least that's how things have gone for the majority of players. And the Packers get the Vikings. The Vikings rank second in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And the last time MVS squared off against Minnesota, he saw a 32% target share en route to a 22.3 PPR point performance. He did make a big play in that game, but Minnesota is also 9th in deep ball rate allowed, so it's not surprising. So I think you got to like his big play potential once again this week. I've only got 2 more players in this tier just because of how the percent rostered numbers sort of broke down this week, and they're both tight end streamers. The first is Gerald Everett. He had a big game in Week 16, catching 4 of his 5 targets for 68 yards and a touchdown. Since Russell Wilson's return from injury, Everett has a 17.5% target share per game in that Seattle offense. Now, Will Dissly was out last week, but even with Dissly, Everett's been running the most routes within that offense at the tight end position. And now Seattle gets Detroit. Detroit's a team that ranks 10th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, so he's a logical streamer. And then the other one is Cole Kmet. He has about a 19% target share this season, and he's seen 5 or more targets in each of his last 5 games. That's really why you're looking his way, to be honest. The tight end position continues to be absolutely terrible, so you need to try to bank on looks. Not the way that Cole Kmet looks, but I mean targets. The matchup is pretty average, but Kmet should give you at least something. This next tier consists of players rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, so we're digging a little bit deeper. And this is where I want to talk about my top quarterback streaming option, Trey Lance, as long as he goes, of course. Lance rushed 16 times for 89 yards in his only start, and he still almost hit 15 fantasy points without a touchdown. And if you recall, he was also about an inch away from scoring a rushing touchdown in that game. Now he gets Houston. You can say what you want about the way Houston's been defending quarterbacks, and I even talked about that on yesterday's 10 Trends show. But it's not a scary matchup, and they've been below average against the run according to Number Fire's expected points model. There's a reason so many analysts hype Trey Lance in the preseason. He has the tools to break fantasy football. I would expect the 49ers to go with a super run-heavy approach this game, and that should include Lance. To me, he's a QB1 this week. Look, I think there's plenty of risk in starting Dare Ogunbowale this week. The Jaguars could utilize other running backs, which would lower Ogunbowale's 81% running back rush share from Week 16. But then on top of that, are the Jags really going to move the ball against the Patriots or move it well? Now, with that being said, Ogunbowale could still have 2 things going for him. Number 1, he may just be the featured back. That's in his range of outcomes. It's definitely in his range of outcomes. Number 2, if this script flips to a negative one, he'd likely be the primary pass catcher for Jacksonville. That's what he's been thus far in the NFL. So I don't love him, but I do need to call him out on this show because things could hypothetically go the right way for him. I'd still only start him if I was desperate. Kadarius Toney returned in Week 16, and he didn't play as a starter. He finished the day with a 53% snap rate. Both Kenny Golladay and Darius Slayton played more snaps, a lot more snaps. Despite this, Toney led the team with 9 targets, and he saw a 22% target share. And according to PFF, he played 75% of his snaps from the slot, which makes sense because Sterling Shepard is sidelined. I obviously don't love the quarterback situation for New York, but you've got to wonder if they just eased him back last week and they might play him more this week. If that's the case, he's got a great slot matchup against Chicago. The Bears are 2nd in target share allowed and 3rd in yards allowed to the slot this year. Of course he's risky. Anyone I'm talking about today has some risk. But we're talking sleepers, and Toney is definitely that. Let's talk about the Philadelphia backfield. Like I said on the 15 Transactions episode, without Miles Sanders, I prefer Jordan Howard most in that backfield, given he's played ahead of Boston Scott during the second half of the season. But I think Scott works as a sleeper regardless of Howard's status. He gets a boost if Howard doesn't go, of course. But the Eagles ran all over Washington 2 weeks ago, and they continue to be a super run-heavy team. They haven't finished a game with more passes than rushes since Week 7. And since that point in time, from Week 8 through Week 16, the Eagles have averaged 30.5 running back rush attempts per game. That's 2.5 more than the Colts, who rank 2nd in the league with 28 running back rush attempts per game over this time. So Scott should see more work without Miles Sanders. He's at least a flex play if Jordan Howard goes, but if Howard doesn't, he's an RB2. Let's dig into the deep sleepers or players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues you could consider starting this week. I'd say you probably shouldn't rely on these players in a championship, or I at least hope that you don't have to rely on them. But maybe you're in a super deep league. I get it. I feel you. The first guy is Keyshawn Vaughn. I talked about Vaughn on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week, and the logic here is pretty simple. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, Tampa Bay is a massive favorite this week. The Jets are by far the worst team in the NFL against running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And while Vaughn got by this past week on a big play that resulted in a touchdown, he could see some garbage time if things go the way the betting markets and really everyone on the planet thinks that it's going to go. I wouldn't be surprised if he finishes an RB3 or even a low-end RB2 this week. Another player I think is sneaky this week, and this is like incredibly deep considering what happened last week, but it's Tyler Johnson. Johnson didn't record a target last week. He did absolutely nothing. But Mike Evans didn't play. In Evans' spot was Cyril Grayson, who played 84% of his snaps out wide according to PFF. Tyler Johnson played way more snaps than Scotty Miller. He was the number 3 option, and even though Mike Evans has COVID, he may be able to go this week. So if Evans goes, I'd expect Tyler Johnson to be their slot guy. Now, if Evans doesn't go, I think you could look at Brashad Perriman. He didn't play the last 2 weeks because he was on the COVID list, but he'd likely take on that perimeter role, the one that Grayson played last week. So there are a lot of moving parts within this Buccaneers offense, but I'm interested in the Bucs offense because of the matchup against the Jets. I can't imagine you have to dig that deep for a championship matchup, but you never know. Braxton Berrios played the most snaps for the Jets this past week without Jamison Crowder in the picture. He was 4th the week prior, but without Crowder, Berrios was able to play 65% of his snaps from the slot. He saw a 30% target share against the Jags this past week, and he's now seen a 25% target share or better in 2 of his last 3. Now, at the time of this recording, it's being reported that Jamison Crowder is 50-50 this week. So if he doesn't go, Berrios could see a lot of volume in a game against the Buccaneers where the Jets try to keep pace. And then the last deep sleeper, and we're getting deeper than Atlantis here, it's Josiah DeGuara. Mercedes Lewis was put on the COVID list, which could open things up a little bit for DeGuara this week. But DeGuara is actually getting some run regardless. He ran 21 routes this past week and 21 the week before. Maybe that sees a slight uptick if Lewis misses this game. If Lewis is out, I'd put DeGuara in a desperation streamer category. I'd much rather play a Gerald Everett type and even maybe a CJ Uzomah type over him. But their percent roster numbers are just a lot higher. And then as for the streaming defenses this week, as I said on the 15 Transaction Show, I really like Chicago against New York. Defenses against the Giants since Daniel Jones' season-ending injury, they've averaged almost 12 standard fantasy points per game. So they're a good play. And then if Carson Wentz doesn't go, you could look at Vegas. If he does go and you still need a defense, Cleveland works as well. That's the other defense that I talked about on Tuesday's show. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got one more show for you this week, the mailbag episode. That'll drop tomorrow.